Well, it's a great joy to welcome you. I'm sorry to disrupt conversation. Please continue eating and return to the buffets. This is designed as a lunchtime conversation, and we're just incredibly honored to have with us former Governor Bill Haslam and his wife Chrissy with us today. Bill and Chrissy have been friends of Susan's and mine, and we're just thrilled to have them here. Rarely do you encounter people who don't need any kind of introduction, but in Nashville, Tennessee, I think that's fair to say, but I still want to say a few words about it before we begin the conversation. Bill was in business with his family's company, a small startup, right? That's doing pretty well. Pilot gas stations. And then he became mayor of Knoxville for 8 years before becoming governor of Tennessee. And from the first conversations that I had with Bill, I was struck by the ways in which he personifies and embodies what I think we need in leadership in so many different ways, not just in Tennessee, but in this country and around the world. Because he's a person of deep faith who brings that to life, whether in business or in politics, as a problem solver, in the kinds of relationships that he has. His emotional and social intelligence, his love of people is just extraordinary. And this spring, we were talking, and I discovered that he was writing a book, and I thought, oh, this will be wonderful to read. And the book came out in May. It's called Faithful Presence: The Promise and the Peril of Faith in the Public Square. And it's not your typical book that you might expect a politician who's recently left office to write, because it's not settling scores. It's not really about him. It's storytelling about how he brought his faith to life in extraordinary ways. And it has his trademark humility as well as leadership gifts. There are places where you just will laugh out loud and places where you'll tear up because of the ways in which he understands and cares about people. So before we begin and I start asking him all the hard questions, would you join me in welcoming former Governor Bill Haslam?
I'm going to jump in before Greg starts asking me all these hard questions and just say to Belmont, congratulations. How do you know when you've chosen the right leader? Is when that leader is on the precipice of his moment of being inaugurated, he decides to interview someone else. So that's congratulations to the board and to all the Belmont community. You've picked the right person. So with that, go ahead. Now go ahead. Now ask me the question.
Thank you. Well, I wanted to, you and I have talked for some time about the importance of the way Christians can help to reweave the social fabric, and I think we both share a concern about the kind of fraying of that fabric. And I guess my first question really is, what do you mean by faithful presence, and why did you write this book?
Well, I wrote the book because while I was in office, one of the things that surprised me in a disappointing way was that I found the community of faith, when it came to the public square, acted just like everyone else. And that's not a good thing. I think all of us, if you said, how do you feel about the political environment, regardless of where you are on the left-right spectrum, would say, I'm frustrated and exhausted by the whole thing, or again, regardless of where you are politically. And we're frustrated that not just the two sides seem like that they disagree, but they disagree and dislike each other, and even more think the other side has bad motives. And one of the reasons I wrote the book is, what I would argue is the greatest sermon ever, the Sermon on the Mount. The clear message of it is to be different. The salt is supposed to be different than the meat. The light is supposed to be different than the dark. But my experience is we, the people of faith, are acting just like everybody else. We're just as likely to say things on the internet that we wouldn't say in person. We're just as likely to pass on conspiracy theories that may or may not have any truth to them. We're just as likely to hate the other side instead of what we're called to do, which is to love our enemies. And this is kind of my plea to say, well, what could change all this? Maybe the answer is we could, the people of faith who are called to act differently.
Well, it shines through the book, and one of the things I've done in coming to Belmont is try to encourage us all to not talk so much about being a Christian university, but being a Christ-centered university, because Christian gets caught up in partisan politics in various ways, and Christ-centered means you're accountable to someone who transcends us. In that sense, and what shines through in the book is the ways in which you've understood your vocation, whether in business or in politics, in life, to be one that's Christ-centered. How does that shape who you are and how you think about the things you do?
I hope for all of us who call ourselves Christians, we'd say everything we do is different. The way we practice medicine and the way we operate our businesses and the way we run schools is different. And I think to me, one of the reasons I'm excited about what you all are doing at Belmont, what you've been doing, I know the reason that you and Susan came here is this chance to be at Christ-centered university, being the very best of academics, the very best. And we're going to bring in the best people, whether it be in our law school, our business school, our school of medicine, whatever it is. But we're also going to be unabashed about saying that we're here because we think this is where Jesus has called us to be, and to not think those two things are in conflict with each other at all.
One of the things that I love about the way you talk, the way you work, and it shines through in the book, is a sense of humility. This is not either settling scores, nor is it just a book about your triumphs. You tell some really moving stories about when you missed an opportunity, whether that was in Africa or when you belatedly thought, that probably wasn't me at my best. How hard was that to kind of put into a book? I mean, it's an extraordinary thing to see somebody saying, I didn't get everything right.
Well, it's one thing about being in a very visible public office. You actually don't have to tell people you didn't get it all right. I kind of can see that as it happens and as it plays out. But I mean, I think kind of, again, foundational, it's one of the things that a great institution of learning like this that's founded, it's founded in Christ, starts with is this idea that we don't get it all right. We kind of say up front, we're fallen, broken people. That's kind of at the basis of who we are. And a lot of people have heard me quote my political mentor. The people who are longtime Tennesseans will remember Howard Baker, who was senator from Tennessee and majority leader of the Senate, who was Reagan's chief of staff and ambassador to Japan under H.W. Bush. And Baker was from a little town north of Knoxville called Huntsville, a little coal mining town. You could fit the whole town just in this part of the building. And Baker had a saying that said, always remember the other fella might be right. And I think that's based on, we know, hey, as a believer, I know I messed up, 732 times today, okay, in so many ways. So I know if it's true, then I might not have it all right on my position of what I believe about this policy or political issue.
One of the things I've discovered in Nashville as I keep meeting people, some of whom are Belmont connected, is you seem to have had a very large Bible study that met regularly when you were in Nashville, and the friendships that were forged. Talk about the kind of behind-the-scenes ways in which you were sustained as a leader, prayed for, and got kind of a way to navigate that public role that you were playing.
I firmly believe the reality that all of us, no matter what you're doing in life, you need some people around you who know you and love you regardless of what you're doing and have a sense of accountability to you. And I had a group of 8 guys, Anderson Spickert's here on the part of the new medical school. He was one of those guys, and we kind of decided early we were going to help each other through the ups and downs of life. And the benefit to me is I had a group of people around me when I was in the governor's office who occasionally, not all the time, but occasionally would lean in and say, hey, I saw what you did or said about this, and I don't think that's you. I don't think that's who you are trying to be. I don't think that's who you want to be as a follower of Christ. And that was immeasurable help, because one of the things you learn in political office is people, you're either the greatest ever or you're pond scum. Nobody really deals with you in a realistic way and gives you honest feedback. And some people are like, oh man, the governor, the greatest ever, or, how many more days are you in office? So there's not a lot in between. And so having some folks who I knew were for me, loved me, but would give me honest feedback at times, I don't know what can replace that.
You tell a story in the book about a woman named Sequoia who was a pretty high-profile case, and where you took time to deliberate and try to discern. Talk some about well, I'd love for people who aren't from Tennessee and don't know visibly what the circumstances, but also the journey and how other people helped you and kind of your own reflections on that, because it wasn't something, most people think that leaders and especially politicians just kind of check where the polls are, where the winds are blowing and make a quick decision and move on. This was something that you lived with for quite some time.
So yeah, if you're from here, you remember because it got so much national attention. But Sequoia Brown is a woman that grew up here in Middle Tennessee, biracial child, adopted by an African American family, ended up in and out of a lot of various state institutions, and as a result of a lot of things, ended up basically working on the streets as a 16-year-old girl. And Sequoia herself would say, hey, I made a lot of bad decisions along the way, but no 16-year-old girl chooses to be working on the streets in the sex trade, you might say. So one night, not too far from here, she gets picked up by a customer and ends up at his house and, in her words, commits the horrific crime of shooting him while they're in bed together, takes his truck and leaves. She ends up, obviously gets caught and is sentenced to life in prison as a juvenile. And in Tennessee, once she ended up getting tried as an adult even though she was 16. Life meant she would basically have to serve until she was 74 years old before she could be released. Somebody picks up the story and does a documentary on her called Me Facing Life, a Sequoia Brown story. And it gets the attention of lots of folks. Now, you could be in office and think a whole lot of people follow your Twitter or your Facebook or Instagram, but if you're Snoop Dogg and LeBron James and Kim Kardashian and on, they have a lot of followers, like millions. And so they all picked up the cause of Sequoia, and hashtag Free Sequoia became the trending hashtag, for a period of time. And we were flooded with people saying, this isn't right that this girl that was sentenced in 16 would spend the rest of her life. Again, a lot of extenuating circumstances, but she was caught up in the sex trade. So we were left with this very public decision. And one of the issues that came up as we started doing research, we found there were like 70 people in our system who had been sentenced as juveniles to life. I had made the decision early in my term as governor not to look at any of the pardon and parole decisions until my last 6 months, which was a big mistake because it didn't give us, I thought it would be easy to figure it out, okay, this one stays, this one, I thought, well, I can figure that out and I can be just and merciful at the same time. And we had all these cases in front of us. There was hardly any way we'd be able to figure out the right thing on all of them. So we had this Sequoia because it got all this national attention. Do we treat her differently than other folks because it hasn't? Or do we say, well, we're not going to treat her different, so we're going to treat her worse somehow? And it became this very public decision. In the end, I became Sequoia Meanwhile head while she was in prison, had gotten a degree from Lipscomb in prison, got a 4.0. She had become the very picture of what you hope but rarely happens in the prison system of rehabilitation, and had a plan for if she got out, kind of how to surround herself in community. And so we made the decision to grant her clemency as of 15 years after the date she committed the crime, which would have been probably, if she'd been sentenced today, how long she was sentenced. But there were a couple of things a couple of kind of takeaways. Number one, we all think we know how to be just and merciful at the same time, but it's really, really hard to do both of those. Really hard. And it gave me a greater appreciation for the picture of the cross, where justice and mercy happened at the same time. So that was one of my big takeaways. And the second was, after we left office, So we left office in January of 19. She was going to be released in August of 19. Chrissy and I went to visit her at the Tennessee Prison for Women, not far north of here. And we sat there in the room and talked, and we couldn't have different backgrounds. I'm incredibly privileged. White male from East Tennessee. She grew up, like I said, not far from here with a lot of extenuating circumstances. But, when Paul says, in Galatians, in Christ there's either Jew nor Gentile, slave nor free, male nor female, but we're all one in Christ. The three of us sitting there talking, I realized God had kind of woven our stories together in a way that nobody could have ever seen coming. But we were brother and sisters in a very real way. And like I said, every now and then God lets you see the back of the tapestry and see what was woven together. In Sequoia's case, that's what happened in ours.
When you tell the story in the book, it's quite moving. Both the honesty with which you reflected on wrestling with a tough decision, and then the story of you and Chrissy after you're out of office going to visit in the prison and seeing a sister in Christ. It was one of those moments in a book filled with, kind of show-stopping moments where I just pause and take a deep breath. But that one I had to wipe away a tear because of that.
I still do. We went to lunch with her recently, and again, that same, just marvelous picture of the body of Christ and how it works.
Mm-hmm. It's inspiring in a time when it's easier to be cynical than to be inspired. So thank you for that. I want to actually ask you to talk a little bit about your and Chrissy's relationship that Susan and I have admired, the way you all are a partnership and a team, and the role that Chrissy played as First Lady of Tennessee in concern for children, and just talk a little bit about the role she played in your leadership.
So one of the cool things about being governor, same true in your new role, and it's another reason why Belmont hit a home run, because you get Greg and Susan, and there are not a lot of roles where you get to do them together, right? In business, it's sometimes hard to make that work. If you're a surgeon, your spouse doesn't get to go into the operating room with you. There's just a whole lot of places that doesn't work, but in this role, it does. And Chrissy had taken the extraordinary step of everywhere I went campaigning, she went with me, and so she knew the people and she knew the issues, so she knew the difference in Hancock County and Tipton County, and she had, as she said, did everything I did. She just did it in high heels. And so when we came into office, she was incredibly prepared to be a part of that, and so it made it better, because everybody that went to college, Chrissy and I met in college, and if you went to college with us, you're shocked that it's like, no, they got it backwards. Chrissy should be the governor. So it made it better because she, was able to, bring her gifts and talents, but it also just made it more fun. And it's a gift when you get to do leadership together. So for us, there are a lot of things that were wonderful about the 8 years we got to spend in office, but one of the key ones, which was a great surprise, was we got to do it together. And that's why, like I said, I couldn't be more excited for you and Susan being in this role, because I think you all very much do this together.
We are enjoying that. The only trouble for me is that when we are both around, people gravitate toward her very quickly. So,
welcome to my
That's a great joy. Some of the priorities and some of the things you did were really encouraged by Chrissy and some of those initiatives. How did that shape your own thinking about the kind of difference you could make as governor?
So Chrissy, very early, one of our big focuses in office was education, and public education, because it was such a critical issue, and we've historically lagged the rest of the nation in Tennessee. And Chrissy very early caught on to the importance of children learning how to read, making certain they were grade ready level, at least by third grade, and a lot of the early intervention importance around education. So a lot of the things we ended up doing, she was the one that was ahead of the curve for me. And so again, a lot of our policy came about from things where she knew from experience this is a problem, and you can do all you want to correct this on the back end, but we're way better to do it on the front end. So again, a lot of early childhood education things were her focus in office, and later she moved toward a focus on foster children and adoption. you know, in Tennessee, we actually, relatively, we don't have as bad of a problem as other places. In some ways, like, hey, maybe it's encouraging. Maybe we actually can find a forever home for every child that's looking for one. And kind of moved everything. How do we engage the faith community and churches to be a part of that support network? So, like I said, it's several kind of key things like that that she was a part of, and we kind of said, hey, that's actually a really good policy. Let's see if we can get all the state government behind that now.
So it's one of the things that drew us to the two of you with admiration is Susan cares a lot about early childhood education and children. And I surprised Susan earlier this week by setting up a scholarship endowment here for people going from first-generation students coming especially from community college to four-year education. She was a first-generation student, and then her mom late in life went to community college, and you know, she just pours into young kids and wants to see them get that kind of sense. And so I realized that, you know, especially just because of who you marry, their priorities become your priorities. And it's been so inspiring to me to see the ways in which that shapes things. And that's one of the things you talked about education. You talked about what you did, and you know, the work you've done with community colleges was, you know, one of your extraordinary achievements, bipartisan at a time when I'm not sure that word is still used very often. And the potential from foster children, adoption, getting a home, and getting a good start, getting started well, all the way through access as community colleges. Why does that matter so much?
Listen, I'm firmly convicted of the reality that I actually don't believe that we should have equal outcomes for everybody. I don't think that's realistic in the world, but I do believe we should have more equal opportunities for everyone. And if you're going to do that, that's going to be more opportunities in education. I love that you set up a scholarship around folks coming from community college and coming to Belmont, because when we started Tennessee Promise, it was with that idea that a lot of people would just need 2 years community college and they could go take that associate's degree and do whatever they wanted. But our hope was that a decent number would come on to four-year schools. And I love that you all are doing that. The reality is a lot more jobs today than 20 years ago, and even more 20 years from now, are going to require a degree or certificate. And for way too many families, they just don't see that as part of anything on their radar screen. And what we try to do at Tennessee Promise is say that every kid in Tennessee, like, no, you can go to college. Like, there is, right now, we can tell you, there's a way, all you have to do is graduate high school. And then we could also say to that 50-year-old who dropped out forever ago, you can go back to college for free now too. And I think it's foundational for who we want to be as a society to give people that kind of opportunity. And again, it's why I think the mission that you all are about here is so critical.
I was struck as you talked about not just Tennessee Promise, but then I think it's called Tennessee Reconnect.
Right.
That was for the 50-year-old coming back.
But for a newcomer, you're better informed than like most Tennesseans.
I just love the way in which what that did was to say that wherever you are in formal education, you can always learn more. And it seems to me that the world in which we live is one where we need not just lifelong learning, but perpetual learning, because we need to keep learning and growing, and the jobs that are going to be available aren't ones that were going to be available even if you went to a four-year school from 18 to 22, that the kinds of challenges we face are ones that are going to need opportunities for ongoing learning. We've got to flip the kind of mindset of education from, you know, you finish education at 22 and then go off, to think more about that. How did you decide that Tennessee Reconnect would be so important as part of your work?
Well, I mean, listen, at the end of the day, I think a lot of things are a math problem. And we had done some research.
It's dangerous to say the school known for music.
I know, I get it. But the math still matters, okay? And particularly in public policy. And we had done some work, and we knew that this is in 2012, but by 2025, which then seemed like a long time away, that 55% of all of the jobs in Tennessee would require a degree or certificate. And I said, well, that doesn't sound bad. Where are we now? And they said 32. And then we started doing the math, and even if every high school graduate went on and got a community college degree, which we knew was not going to happen. That would just barely get us to 55, and so we knew that was not going to happen. And we knew if it was going to work, we'd have to go back, and some of those folks who had left education without a degree or certificate, we'd have to go back and give them an opportunity too. And it became, I have a very real picture of this. There was a woman who worked at the governor's residence on the housekeeping team, and she, in the middle of this, start of our last year in office, said, "I'm going back to school," and I hadn't been to school in 35 years. And it was fun for me because I got to see her every day, and she'd come in and say, "How's class?" She goes, "I don't think I can." I mean, after the first 3 weeks, she said, "I don't think I can do this, and it's just too hard. I can't. My memory doesn't work like it used to be." I mean, we all learned that way still. She said,
What you said?
She said, "I think I'm going to quit." And I said, "Well, hang in there." And so, fortunately, one of the college, the counselors, she's at Nashville State, kind of came alongside her and helped, and saw her. We didn't see her for a while because of COVID, but saw her 2 or 3 weeks ago, and she said she brought me she brought me her dean's list certificate. Oh, it's kind of cool, right?
Oh, wow.
The bad news is the governor's residence is going to lose an employee.
That's neat. Well, you mentioned Nashville State. We had Shonda Jackson here yesterday on our president's panel. She is just a treasure and such a dynamic leader. And I think you know that our board chair, Milton Johnson, is a Belmont grad. What you may not know is he actually started at what was then Nashville Tech. And so he himself embodies that continuity from a community college to a 4-year university, child of a single mom, and just extraordinary.
He ended up doing okay, Mark.
He did okay. It's not been bad. In that, I want to zoom out a little bit. Coming to Tennessee, it's where I was born and lived for all of 6 months, so I have a long memory of my earlier stint in Tennessee. But moving back here in May, one of the things that has struck Susan and me is how similar North Carolina, where we've lived for much of the last 25 years, is very similar to Tennessee. You've got some urban areas that are doing very well. Your hometown of Knoxville, Nashville, Memphis to a lesser degree, but then you have a lot of rural areas that are distressed and really struggling, which, one of the things I've been saying is that Belmont says it's Nashville's university, and that's a really good thing, and we love being connected to Nashville, but I've also been saying, if the rural areas around Nashville don't thrive, it's ultimately not good for Nashville. And even Nashville has some paradoxes to it, that, the Athens of the South doesn't have all that great educational outcomes. Whereas Bill Frist was reminding us yesterday in a panel on healthcare disparities that Healthcare City has some pretty bad health outcomes, both in Nashville and Davidson County. The rural areas are even more challenging in those ways. We just came off a panel talking about promoting an entrepreneurial spirit, and I think Tennessee could be an incubator, and if the colleges and universities come together. From your perspective as a governor, and you think about the state of Tennessee and the rural areas and the urban areas, what should we be most worried about in terms of challenges, and where do you see the greatest opportunities for real growth and flourishing for the state?
It's a great question, and I think there's some opportunity. Tennessee just recently announced that Ford's going to build the largest automotive plant in their history in West Tennessee, rural West Tennessee, which I can't tell you what a big deal. I mean, huge investment, lots of employees, but the fact of where it is really important. So I think there is some hope, and Tennessee's kind of focused on that. But it's also, kind of throwing back to you, it's one of the reasons when Belmont announced you, I thought this is a great fit. Correct me if I'm wrong, but when you were at Duke Divinity, you had a lot, just due to their responsibility to provide Methodist ministers throughout the state. A lot of those folks were going back to rural areas. So y'all were in Durham, fast-growing, like Nashville, hot, very urban area, very diverse population. A lot of those folks were going to small-town North Carolina, which looks a lot like small-town Tennessee. So
it does indeed.
Yeah, so I'm kind of curious. What did you learn from that experience about, we're sending people out to lots of different type of places that might help here?
Well, thanks. Susan ran our internship program for several years, and she would take me with her when she went to visit, and we visited a number of Methodist churches that you couldn't find via GPS. You had to go to the end of the road and then off the beaten track, and you got there, and yet there were still good people gathering for worship and those sorts of things. One of the things that we have discovered that I think is promising is that those churches could be real great resources for revitalization in rural areas. And that's true also in Tennessee. There was a guy, son of a preacher in Charlotte, who'd gone into commercial real estate. And he's done very well, and now he's doing some work for the Duke Endowment, the private philanthropy in Charlotte. You know, as you know, Mr. Duke said if he ever amounted to anything in life, it'd be thanks to his father and to the preaching of rural Methodist preachers. So that's why Duke Divinity School has a program for rural churches, and we place students there, and they got significant help with their education in that way. And so what this guy did was he mapped, just in the western part of North Carolina, the land and the buildings that were just Methodist. So factor out Baptist, Lutheran, Episcopalian, Catholic, anybody else, non-denominational. The good news was he realized that the assets that the Methodist congregations had, land and buildings, meant that the Methodist Church was the second largest landowner in the state, after the state government. The bad news was that Joel also did research about their usage, 12% a week. And he said, you know, in commercial real estate and retail, you need 68% usage a week to break even. We're at 12% in churches. He said, imagine if you tripled the usage of those churches. What could happen in a rural community? He said, that gets you to 36%, which would be barely half of commercial retail. But imagine what could happen. You know, a lot of those churches have commercial kitchens. They have gathering places. They have things that, by the way, in the wake of COVID, they also have steeples. Yeah. And you know, bandwidth has been exposed as a crisis in America, especially rural America, some urban America as well. But you know, there's statistics that 48% of Americans don't have access to bandwidth, which you know, widen the educational gap and all sorts of other gaps. So one of the ways, you know, could you use steeples in some of these rural churches to improve bandwidth? But also, you know, could you find ways, and this goes back to the 0 to 8 kind of thing. The state of North Carolina, you know, everybody knows the third grade reading level matters hugely for future success. And so 0 to 8 is a really critical time. The state of North Carolina realized the summer slide, under-resourced kids, you know, fall behind during the summer. So they started a program to try to improve reading levels. And they found that the state of North Carolina's program could stem the summer slide and get it back to normal. The Duke Endowment did some work in rural congregations. And their program, a 6-week reading program, produced a 3-month growth. Not only did they stem the summer slide, they actually accelerated where the state of North Carolina went, whoa, you've got something going that we don't. And one of the things that we discovered was that what was happening in those congregations was the volunteers were providing nutritious meals to the commercial kitchen. And then the volunteers were also saying to the kids, hey, can we take you for ice cream this afternoon? Want to go to a movie? And it was those relationships, you know, the kind of big brother, big sister, you know, when you're talking about foster care, the more love you pour into young kids, the more of a long-lasting difference it makes. And so there are, I think, huge opportunities for how we work in rural areas, and I think we've underestimated the role congregations can play in that. But I also think that we need to cultivate that entrepreneurial spirit, because a lot of the jobs that are going to be created are, you know, going to be at the local level, and they're going to require that kind of investment. And you know, we've been Janet Ayers is on our board. She and Jim have a foundation that works in rural areas, mostly in West Tennessee, around Parsons, where they're from, also a couple counties in East Tennessee. And they've been doing amazing things with education. But one of the things Janet said to me is, you know, if we send our kids to get educated, that's a great gift, but they're not coming back, because there aren't the places and the vitality. And I think we saw both in physical health and in mental health. You know, if you don't have those services, it's a huge challenge. And yet Tennessee is the kind of state where it seems to be we ought to be able to address these challenges, whether it's Ford, Oracle coming here. Jobs are going to be available, but then I worry about the misalignment between how universities are used to forming people and whether they're going to be ready for the jobs that are available, which is why I think community colleges matter. We've got to do a much better job. K-12, community college, 4-year, and kind of flip our mindset. It's going to require collaboration that we're not quite used to.
I think and I'll just end with this, or in that part. One of the things I learned in being in office is the connection of all that. To the connection between K through 12 and community colleges, 4-year schools, and the job needs. It's a much tighter circle than I thought it was. And people ask me all the time, like, what do you wish you'd done while you were in office? And usually my answer is just more of the same. I learned, and these are the important things. And I kind of learned how connected all that was as I went, and I wish I'd had time to kind of tighten the connectors within the state so that it would work better.
I want to pick up on that and shift to a different theme that also shines through your book and also your leadership, and that is friendships and relationships. We talked a little bit about it with the Bible study, but you are one of those people who cares a lot about people, and you have a gift for relationships, not in a politically superficial way of just, glad handing or whatever caricatures are there, but you care about relationships and people. We met through a mutual friend, Don Flo, who you developed a friendship with as a young businessman that would gather together on a regular basis, and you've maintained that relationship now for better part of 3 decades or so. That's also how a lot of stuff gets done. That there's bureaucracy when there's distrust, but when there are friendships and trust, things can happen much more nimbly and creatively, and the connections can be much thicker. How do you think about your relationships and friendships and making sure you tend them even whether as governor and you're responsible for a whole state and your schedule is overly booked every day, or how do you think about the priorities of how you spend your time now?
Yeah, I think 2 or 3 thoughts. I really do believe in most things, whether it's running a university, running a state, whatever it is. If you get the relationships right, most other things tend to work out. So, if you get the relationships right between the president, and the faculty, and the students, et cetera, that other things tend to fall in line. So that'd be the first thing. The second thing is, that's just, to me, that's how my life has been enriched. We talked about that Bible study group. We were all in the mountains this past weekend with our spouses, and I drove home thinking this is the good stuff. This is what makes life rich, and I firmly feel that. And the third thing I'd say, and this is to all of us who, because of where you are in life, you've developed a certain, we don't have Rolodexes anymore, but you've developed a certain Rolodex, okay? And one of the ways that we can most help people is open up our Rolodex to them. You have a Rolodex because of your position that can help somebody that maybe comes from a more diverse background that has no exposure, such a big thing. And the further you go in life, the more exposure you have to people who can help someone. If somebody, we need somebody, I think, well, there's probably somebody I know I can call about that. But that's not true of everybody, particularly if you come from, people you just don't get to run in those same circles. So one of the things I'd encourage all of those folks in this room is think about how do you help somebody by sharing your Rolodex. Like, hey, I think I know somebody that can help you. Because, again, when you look at people younger than you and people that haven't had the same exposure, I think that might be one of the biggest difference makers there could be.
Thanks. I realize that we're of a similar age, that both of us think about Rolodexes, and young people, they look at you like they think you're speaking a foreign language.
There's an ad for that in the newspaper.
That's right. There's that. I recall we were together at a retreat that Nathan and Julie Hatch convened several years ago in Wake Forest, and had a wonderful weekend. And then it was the next day that I was asked if I'd go back and serve another term at divinity school, which was not the last thing in the world I had in view. And I remember you and Nathan and Don and I were all talking about things we might do, and when you stepped down from office 6 months later. And so that sounded a lot more fun than going back into a university role. And I remember a phone conversation where...
You have about an hour and a half to change your mind.
That you and Don and I had on the phone, and it was striking because I thought you both were going to say, "Oh no, let's do this other fun stuff," and you said to me, "You said no, it's really important. You need to do this." And I said, "Why?" And you said, "Because institutions matter, and we've had too many kind of little things here and there, and we need weighty institutions, and we need people to lead weighty institutions." And it was one of those moments when I kind of knew already I was going to do that, and that was probably what my calling was. But it was also one of those moments that I thought, dadgummit, he's right. And I thought that actually it wasn't only you speaking, it was God speaking through you to me in that moment. And it stayed with me. It actually did have an impact in my discernment about Belmont, because I thought I wasn't, when I was going to finish divinity school, I was going to go back to all that other fun stuff. And discovered that, Belmont could be that fun stuff, and that institutions really do matter. Talk a little bit about how you came to that conclusion, about the importance of institutions in renewing our social fabric and helping preserve democracy, and all the stuff you talked about in Faithful Presence.
Institutions have leverage that individuals don't have. So, as Greg Jones, even 10 years from now, if you're a Greg Jones individual, there's things you can do, but it won't have nearly the leverage of what you can do through Belmont. And it's just true. And I saw that as governor. The community college deal, we had actually piloted on a small basis in Knox County when I was mayor of Knoxville. But we were raising the money philanthropically. We couldn't go to a new mother and say, when your child is baby's 18, I promise you he or she will have free community college. But we could as the state. We could put that program in place. And so that's a leverage that you can do as an institution. There are things, again, that I already know because I know how entrepreneurial you are and how much you are focused on how do we have high impact. And there are things that you're going to be able to do in this role that if you were Greg Jones who had a business, down the street that you couldn't do. And so it's one of the reasons that it's important that in institutions we take our role real seriously. And if you're leadership of any kind involved in Belmont, know that the impact you have is way bigger than you think, and far more long-lasting than you might think it is. And we've had a fascinating conversation going on. Some people might say it's frustrating about the whole idea of institutional racism. Is it, what's part of what's an institutional issue and what's more of a human problem issue? And to me, it signifies that institutions' impacts, for good or bad, are bigger and longer than we might think they are. And also the importance of digging down into the roots of who we are and making certain that we're who we want to be and who we say we are.
Right. I have started thinking about institutions as kind of they're like the offensive linemen in football, that we only notice them when they really make mistakes, and yet they're part of what enables everything else to flourish. And when you have healthy institutions, you can see lots of things happening. There may be the backdrop scenery in a play or something, but when you don't have them, you all of a sudden notice the problem that we have, and there's just a lot of mushiness of that we've got to.
If you think about it, there's how many students you have? 7,000?
8,800.
Okay. You've grown since. Okay, so 8,800 students who are coming in here, and they're all going to go out and go really different directions. But their experience here, one way or another, will be an inflection point. It really will be. And so, again, if you think about the chance to multiply 1 times 8,800, the impact is far and wide and long.
Yeah, well, thanks. I want to return to the kind of theme of reweaving the social fabric. When you were trying to decide whether you were going to stay in public life and run for another office, and we were praying for you, Susan and I were. We were genuinely praying for you and Chrissy just for discernment. That was kind of our overarching aim, but we also kept saying to each other, boy, it'd be great if they did. You know, and it was really because of a concern about democracy and the promise and peril of the public square, whether it's faith or not in the public square. You know, I was thinking about when I was spending a lot of time in South Africa in the 90s, and they were struggling about how to have free and fair elections and the future of their country, and I kept thinking, you just need to get it fixed like we have it, because we've got it all solved and we're in great shape. A friend of mine from South Africa sent me an email and said, how's that stuff in America doing so? It seems a lot more fragile than it did. And you've devoted a significant part of your adult life to trying to preserve that social fabric, to thicken it, to deepen it. To young people who are thinking about their vocation, whether it be to go into law and politics, or whether it's to go into music and music business, or whether they become a physician or a nurse or a teacher or a pastor. You know, the range of vocations we have at Belmont's pretty broad. What does faithful citizenship and leadership look like for the public square? What do you hope that graduates of Belmont and other universities would be like as people?
Well, one thing, and I'm going to botch the quote, I'm not going to get it right, but Martin Luther had a quote where he said, send your very best into public life. He said, in preaching, the Holy Spirit does all the work. But in public life, you have to deal with the ambiguities and messiness of the situation. So it's the requirement, you know, he didn't say this, but it's more of an uphill climb, so send your very best people to do it. And I still feel that way. Like I said, at that point in time, we were thinking about whether or not to run for the Senate, and decided not to, and feel like that's been the right decision. But I still hope that God gives me some kind of public role to play, whether that's in elected office or not, again, because I think it's such a leverage point and it matters. So I hope that Belmont is sending out people into the world, regardless of where you are on the political spectrum, who are committed to being a faithful part of that discussion. And that faithful presence means being faithful and being present. You can't be present if you're not there. And there's a verse in Jeremiah 29, if you remember, the Israelites have been carried off into bondage and they're in Babylon being held captive. And Nebuchadnezzar is not a good guy, okay? Think of your worst person leader ever, and he's in that category. Jeremiah, they haven't taken him. He's back in Jerusalem, and he writes them. And I always say, if I'm being held captive and you write me, I hope you say, I'm coming to get you. But he writes them and says, get used to it. He says, you're going to be there a while. And he said, so build houses and plant gardens and have your children marry. And then he ends in Jeremiah 29:7 and says, seek the welfare of the place where you have been called. Think about it, they've been called into slavery, but seek the welfare of that place. It says, for in its welfare you will find your welfare. And I hope that Belmont is sending out people that are seeking the welfare of all the different places they've been called, whether it's Music Row or an operating room or in some far off land, that they're seeking the welfare of that place and that they realize they've been called there.
Thanks. I think in just a few minutes, Susan is hoping that the Holy Spirit will do all the work. As we conclude, I want to invite you to just offer briefly a word to all of us at Belmont of what you would hope we would be about. If you look out, I've been talking a lot to our community about what we're going to be like in 2030. But if you, knowing Nashville and Tennessee, given your leadership and everything, what do you think for that Belmont might be different, might grow in ways that would stretch us, but it's advice to the whole community of what you would hope, or a charge to us?
So this is actually a good one, a good question to ask. So Chrissy and I mainly live in Knoxville now, but we also kept a house in Nashville that's literally a half mile away, and this is on my jogging path in the morning. And so, because I don't jog that fast anymore, I have a lot of time to run back. It takes me a lot longer to do this stretch than it used to. But so I do think about that, and then when I knew you and Susan were coming, we did, and then again had my friend Anderson come, I did start praying and thinking about Belmont in a different way. And so I think my prayer is this, is that this 30 years from now would be a distinctively Christian institution that is Christ-centered. And it realize that's our mission, is to show our neighborhood around us and Nashville and the world, like, here's what it means to be distinctively Christian. It would also be a full part of seeking the welfare of this place. And that might take on a lot of different looks, but I hope it's a campus where a lot of different people feel welcome and the community sees this as an asset. I love that, you know, Belmont's famous for hosting presidential debates, but when I ran for governor, we had 2 different debates here. And kind of, I can remember January of 2010, and the very first debate I was ever in was on the stage here, and I can remember backstage wanting to throw up. But I also remember thinking, like, this is cool. This is kind of what great universities should be doing. They should be part of the fabric of the community and the state and involved in the discussions about what's next. And so that's kind of my hope for Belmont, is it distinctively Christian and seeking the welfare of this place that God, I mean, you think about when Belmont was started, if you could pick a location, Nashville, to be in,
Could be here.
you know, if you got to start at scratch, if you could, given where Nashville's going, if you could pick a spot to be, you might argue for this spot, right? And so you've been plopped down in this great spot in a city that has become, you know, prominent around the world, and that's only going to increase. Everything that's happened in Nashville, it's going to be more of it, I promise you. And so you've been given this great piece of real estate to seek the welfare of in the neighborhood around it.
I think that's a wonderful charge. If you ask me, what I hope for from Belmont over the next few years, I would hope it would be that we would raise up future Bill and Chrissy Haslams who provide the kind of faith-centered leadership. Susan and I are honored that you would spend this time with us. Would you join me in thanking Bill?